From Lisbon, this is Frontlines and Backrooms Brief, the key stories shaping our world this week and the commentary that makes sense of them.
Welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms Brief. This week, powers spoke in different languages: security, money, and memory. And let's begin. This week, from Germany. The 2026 Munich Security Conference was arguably the most sobering in decades. The overarching theme this year, under destruction, signaled a departure from previous years of cautious optimism. The post-1945 rules-based order is no longer described as bruised. For many leaders, it is effectively dead. Hear what was really new in this year's Munich Security Conference and what it tells us about the realigning world order. First, the Wrecking Ball Doctrine. For the first time, the Munich Security Report categorized the United States not as a flawed steward of the system, but as a revisionist power reshaping it. The Trump administration's 2025 national security strategy was a focal point, revealing a Trump consequence to the Monroe Doctrine that prioritizes the Western Hemisphere and treats China as an economic rival rather than a purely ideological one. This confirms a shift from multilateralism, where rules were for everyone, to transactionalism, world of bilateral deals where strongest side wins. Second, the European nuclear reckoning. While strategic autonomy has been a buzzword for years, 2026 brought a concrete high-stakes development: the Franco-German nuclear dialogue. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron moved beyond theory to discuss a European dimension for the French nuclear deterrent. Europe is preparing for a world in which the American nuclear umbrella is no longer guaranteed. Third, civilizational diplomacy versus rules-based order. In his keynotes, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio introduced a new rhetorical framework: civilizational cohesion.
We do not seek to separate, but to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in human history. We do not want our allies to be weak, because that makes us weaker. We want allies who can defend themselves so that no adversary will ever be tempted to test our collective strength. This is why we do not want our allies to be shackled by guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who together with us are willing and able to defend it. And this is why we do not want allies to rationalize the broken status quo rather than reckon with what is necessary to fix it. For we in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline.
So, what would be the main threat to the civilization? In Mr. Rubio's view, it is mass migrations and internal decline. This speech signals a move toward identity-based blocs who align with its cultural border priorities. Instead of defending international law, Secretary Rubio focused on shared Western heritage and preventing civilizational erasure. So, is this the end of the international-based law world? It looks like. Should we be angry with the United States and the second Trump administration for exposing what has been known for decades? No. International law was always implemented only in segments, and when world powers like the United States wanted to do so. The United Nations has been obsolete, long overdue, and late for any kind of reform. They become a debating club for small countries, a place where the General Assembly passes resolutions without possibilities of follow-up actions. Were only powers being in the hands of the Security Council, but only when big and powerful states want it, and if it was in their interest. Obviously, this will be the biggest challenge for small countries. They will be the biggest losers, because the system of international law that was protecting them, at least in theory, is fading away, and they will need to adjust to new realities. If you think my words about the United Nations were too harsh, just look at what happened in Washington. On the 19th of February, the Board of Peace for Gaza had its first meeting. In his opening statement, President Trump announced his strategic vision that the Board of Peace will basically run the United Nations as companies' boards run businesses.
We're going to be working with the United Nations very closely. We're going to bring them back. I think the United Nations has great potential. Really great potential. It has not lived up to potential. The United Nations will be, I think, is going to be much stronger. The Board of Peace is going to almost be looking over the United Nations and making sure it runs properly. But we're going to strengthen up the United Nations. We're going to make sure its facilities are good. They need help, and they need help money-wise. We're going to help them money-wise. And we're going to make sure the United Nations is viable. And you have some very good people at the United Nations can do a good job.
Financial assistance combined with influence over appointments creates structural leverage over the institution. To put on the side that would be buying influence, this is maybe the most direct move to deconstruction of the United Nations as we know today. Should President Trump be blamed for anything? Well, again, no. Because the Board of Peace was sealed and approved by Resolution 2803 adopted in the United Nations Security Council on 17 November 2025. The United Nations signed them off by itself. Still not sure what I'm talking about? Board of Peace will arrange stabilization forces, not United Nations, not UN peacekeepers, but troops from Indonesia, Morocco, Kazakhstan, Kosovo, and Albania. Bearing in mind that President Trump is designated as the chairman of the Board for Peace for Life, Antonio Guterres is getting the new boss until his term as Secretary General ends. Who will be the next Secretary General of the United Nations? Well, that question we will leave to the forever president of the Board of Peace. But the Board of Peace is about Gaza. Absolutely, but above all, it is about the money. Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance.
And the reason that we're here today is, yes, to save lives and yes, to promote peace, but this creates incredible prosperity for the American people. The countries represented here represent trillions of dollars of investment in the United States of America that would not have been possible without this president's leadership and advocacy for peace. The economies here represent millions of American jobs of people who are receiving products built in American factories and made by American workers would not be possible without a focus on peace.
And finally, let's talk about Gaza. Board of Peace will be dealing with the issues in Gaza, above all, construction. Not reconstruction, but new construction of buildings and infrastructure. Before governance, before security, before political rights, the first metric offered was coastline. Former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair.
Yet, as President Trump recognized, its potential has always been vast. 25 miles of Mediterranean coastline, proximity to great regional and global markets, and a young, dynamic population with a median age of 19. So today we set out profound changes necessary to rebuild Gaza for Gazans. Gaza not as it was, but as it should be.
The Board of Peace is pledging to first build 100,000 homes in Rafah for 500,000 people and dedicate $5 billion to infrastructure. In the longer term, housing will expand to encompass 400,000 homes for the whole of the population. Apollo Global Management CEO Mark Rowan said, with more than $30 billion in infrastructure investments. The meeting closed with AI-generated renderings, sparkling towers, man-made waterways, suburban streets, a Gaza that exists only in a computer, projected over the rubble of the real one. Gaza will be connected to the world through an Abrahamic gateway. In total, Rowan valued just the coastline, future housing stock, and infrastructure at $115 billion. There was no mention of where Palestinians would live during construction, nor how new properties would be allocated. The new Gaza will also include tourism and industrial zones, but have provided no further details. And at the end, no coastal redevelopment, valued at $115 billion in modern history, has functioned as social housing. Why would this be the exception? The towering leader of the civil rights movement in the United States, the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson, died this week. He was 84. And in tributes that followed from presidents and organizers, from Chicago to Memphis to Greenville, one word kept appearing: bridge. He was called the living bridge between generations, between the movement that freed African Americans and the work that still remains, between Martin Luther King's dream and Barack Obama's victory. But bridges do not just connect. They bear weight. They endure traffic. They stand while others cross. Jesse Jackson bore all of it. In 1965, he marched from Selma to Montgomery and caught Martin Luther King's attention. 3 years later, he was standing in the parking lot of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis when the bullet rang out. He heard the shot. He watched King fail. He was 26 years old. To understand Jesse Jackson, you have to place him between two poles. Malcolm X spoke to the dignity of the demand. Martin Luther King spoke to the conscience of the nation. Jackson spoke to the possibility, the audacious improbable, stubborn possibility that the system could be made to work. Different in character, in energy that they gave, each played a different role in the architecture of change. This was not about reducing the movement to personalities, but about recognizing that political change required different registers of courage: moral, rhetorical, and organizational. Where King preached, Jackson organized. Where Malcolm demanded, Jackson built coalitions. He took the moral urgency of the movement and translated it into language of political machinery. He ran for president twice. In 1984, he finished third. In 1988, he finished second, winning 13 primaries, 6 million votes, and proving that a black man could compete for the highest office in the land. With these presidential runs, he, as he said, raised the lid for women and other people of color. Barack Obama put it more simply: we stood on his shoulders.
This campaign has taught me much, that leaders must be tough enough to fight, tender enough to cry, human enough to make mistakes, humble enough to admit them, strong enough to absorb the pain, and resilient enough to bounce back and keep on moving.
Those words, always the words, strong and powerful, inspirational but always sharp as knife and on point. In 1984, the Democratic Convention in San Francisco, he gave America a new vocabulary for itself, now famously saying, "Our flag is red, white and blue, but our nation is a rainbow, red, yellow, brown, black and white, and we are all precious in God's sight."
America is not like a blanket, one piece of unbroken cloth, the same color, the same texture, the same size. America is more like a quilt, many patches, many pieces, many colors, many sizes, all woven and held together by a common thread.
4 years later in Atlanta, he gave those who had lost hope something to hold on to.
We must never surrender. America will get better and better. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive on tomorrow night and beyond. Keep hope alive. I love you very much.
And then there was the poem. He repeated to children, to prisoners, to everyone who needed to hear it.
I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am be on welfare, but I am somebody.
That poem was not rhetoric, it was instruction. It was the opposite of everything the world told poor black children they were. By the time Black Lives Matter emerged, Jackson was in his 70s, battling a neurological disorder that would eventually rob him of his ability to move and speak. But he kept showing up. He kept marching. He kept being arrested. Some questioned whether the old guard still mattered, whether the era of charismatic leadership had passed, whether movements should be horizontal, not vertical. But Jackson understood something that critics sometimes miss. Movements need memory. They need people who were there, who remember what worked and what didn't. He was not the leader of Black Lives Matter. He was its witness, its elder, its proof that the fight does not end. At George Floyd's memorial service, Jackson's plaintive call, "I can't breathe," pierced the collective silence in a Minneapolis cathedral. He cried out twice more as the minutes ticked by to symbolize how long Floyd had a police officer's knee pressed on his neck. It was not only Jackson's powerful expression of his own grief over Floyd's death, which sparked global protest against racial injustice. It was a reminder that his voice still carried the singular resonance that for decades made him an international figure for civil and human rights. So, what is his legacy? It is not one thing, it is many. It is the Rainbow Coalition, the idea that poor people of all colors share common cause, which remains the only political vision broad enough to actually challenge power. It is the boardroom strategy, the understanding that civil rights without economic access is incomplete. It is the two presidential campaigns that made Barack Obama presidency possible, that made Kamala Harris possible, that made a generation of black politicians believe they could run for anything. It is the 2008 image of Jackson, tears streaming down his face in Grant Park, watching a black man accept the presidency. Those were not tears of sentiment, they were tears of vindication. 50 years of marching, of speaking, of being arrested, of being dismissed. And there it was, finally, in the cold Chicago air.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot.
But perhaps his truest legacy is simpler. It is the children who heard "I am somebody" and believed it. It is the organizers who learned that coalition outlasts personalities. It is the mourners who left flowers outside his Chicago home this week, still in their scrubs after overnight shifts because they needed to be near him one last time. And as long as there are people willing to march, to organize, to believe that that killed can hold, he is not really gone. He kept hope alive, not as a slogan, but as a discipline. Hope in his hands was never sentimental, it was strategic. That may be his most enduring lesson. Jesse Jackson, 1941 to 2026. At the end, where we are, at the crossroads, witnessing the history in making. As a political sociologist and social scientist, Dr. Zarka Pervez sharply noted, we are not witnessing a system that can be reformed. We are witnessing its unrevealing, a civilization in its final stages where crimes against humanity and the abuse of the power happen openly, involving hundreds of powerful individuals without meaningful consequence. And that's the world this week. From the Frontlines and Backrooms, I'm Vladimir Bobetic, and until next time, keep looking beyond the noise.